Thank you, Federica. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Charest. I am a sector manager in the agriculture and agri-food sector at Genome BC. Thank you for joining us today for our first session, Agri-Smart, Feeding the World in a Changing Climate. As we reflect on the question of climate emergency today, we only need to look back to recent weather events to know that something has profoundly shifted. Climate change is not something that happens elsewhere, and for British Columbians, we can no longer disregard the challenge before us. In this session, our speakers will provide us with real-world perspectives on the challenges of feeding the world in a changing climate and outline some of the issues that still lie ahead. We're going to start with some opening thoughts on the impact of climate emergency from Bill van der Kooi, General Manager of Nutriva, Dr. Eric Gerbrand, Research Director of the Blueberry, Raspberry, and Strawberry Industry Groups, and Jennifer Grenz, Assistant Professor at the University of British Columbia. Then we will be joined by Dr. Anik Rosic, Chief Scientific Officer at Terramera, and Dr. Michel de Souza, researcher at the University of Guelph, for a panel discussion on the potential for climate-smart solutions, followed by an interactive Q&A session with you, the audience. You can ask your question anytime throughout the talk using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. You can also upvote questions as they appear, as well as we draw upon those most popular questions during the Q&A session. I would now like to introduce Mr. Bill van der Kooi, General Manager of Nutriva Group. Bill is a dairy and beef producer, as well as an entrepreneur with a strong interest in research and innovation. I'll now hand it over to our first speaker, Bill van der Kooi.
Thank you, David. I represent Nutriva Group. Nutriva originates from the words nutrition and innovation. Nutriva first came together in 2009. Thank you. And really bringing together business units kind of throughout the value chain, which stems from feed, farm, and the food sectors. I know this is a bit of a busy slide. Today I'm going to focus on the top center, which is Bakerview Farm. Like David said, we're involved in dairy, beef, eggs, and there's quite a diversity of agriculture happening on the farm. And our main focus has really been research and education. It's not a large commercial farm, but it's certainly equipped to do some really good research and also being able to convey and do some knowledge transfer to both public and to school groups. For more information, you can certainly reach out to our website and take a view. So I wanted to start with our mission, which is improving health and well-being through innovation and collaboration. And I think it's really important for us to kind of start with the why. In our case, this is really focusing on planet and people. So when we talk about planet, in our case on the farm, we're looking at crops and livestock, and people looking at producing foods that are nutritious and promote well-being. How we do that is through research and development. We do pilot testing, demonstration, and some of those things will lead to product development as well as business development opportunities. As Federica referred to, we've been faced with some significant challenges in the last year or two. I guess the only way to put it, it's really a climate emergency experience that we've been talking about, but really never experienced kind of firsthand. So to start with, I just wanted to relay our experience through some of these events that have occurred. The first one is the heat dome. In our case, it really affected things like crops. We're fortunate to have some irrigation, but any fields without irrigation were significantly impacted in terms of their yields. In terms of the cattle, for sure, effects on morbidity, and also we did have at least one loss of a beef animal that just was overheating, and these are cattle that are under shade in a barn. But it was just so significant in terms of the temperature and humidity. So ultimately, these things impact productivity. milk yield, meat production, berry crops. Effectively, we have some U-pick berries and blueberries and blackberries, and they shriveled. And as well as just the effect on people and labor and productivity and just general well-being. So yeah, we went from a heat dome to a flood. Again, we were in the impacted zone. Fortunately, we were on the west side, so we feel very fortunate. So we experienced the flooding for several days and impacted for over a week. Our site, yeah, was effectively closed. It was even hard for us to get access to the farm to take care of the animals, and it was just almost like a quarantine for public safety. In terms of immediate damages, we had two buildings that experienced some water damage. Just for a short period, we were fortunate that another dike had sort of been breached or broke and kind of relieved us after about 24 hours. Um, Obviously, a lot of cleanup was required. Took us several days with a lot of people on hand. Crops impacted. I would say, again, talking and just in my conversations with other farms in Sumas Prairie, a significant amount of damage, especially newer seeding crops, depending on variety of grasses, cover crops, berries, yeah, a whole host of crops that were certainly affected significantly. And then manure management became an issue for us in our case, just because the water is filling in our storage lagoons or manure pits. And so just trying to figure out how to manage that and transporting manure to digesters and figuring out how to deal with that. So certainly costly impacts on, yeah, our operations acutely for a week, but then certainly has some lasting effects as well. Yeah, when thinking about climate changes for the beef and the dairy industry, I think from our perspective, the impacts on land use and trying to figure out mitigation um, strategies is really quite critical. Things like irrigation will help us to an extent with a heat dome, but these extreme weather challenges do stress crops, do stress, flooding affects microbiome of the soil, and so I think it makes those crops over time more susceptible to pests and yeah, just effects on productivity and growth. Enteric fermentation, so there's I think there's opportunities, and we're doing some work with that with respect to nutrition. We try to make use of byproducts in our beef production, and um, we find that that's kind of part of the circular economy and trying to upcycle byproducts from other food processors, whether it's whey production or oat processing, for example. But more specifically, looking at innovative, kind of more proactive approaches. So we do work in vertical farming. So we grow grass for grass finished beef in two buildings. So in 2,000 square feet, we grow about 50 acres worth of feed per year. And I think, yeah, it kind of helps with reduction of water usage, land usage, and that sort of thing. Trying to find innovative ways to that locally more efficiently, and also with the improvement on the climate in terms of greenhouse gas uses, etc. Also, the other end of the spectrum is kind of looking at a regenerative agriculture. These are practices that I think the industry to an extent has adopted. We use cover crops, rotation of crops, especially between grass and corn, and even some diversification that's been starting to happen. We're fortunate to be working with on a smaller scale with Archway Community Services, and they're starting a market garden. And again, it's a way to kind of share and transfer information and do some showcasing and demonstration. Manure management, yeah, we have a digester, so we've done some demonstration and pilot testing of manure management, dairy manure that's going through a digester that can produce methane gas that can be used for electricity or upgraded. We have a group that's on site that is doing a lot of research in that area. as well as we do composting, which allows for efficient kind of redistribution of manure that's produced on the farm to other areas, whether in this region or outside, for using as a fertilizer. And then ultimately, I think, yeah, knowledge transfer. We also support an entity called the Eco Dairy, which is really there to do agritourism, communicate where food comes from, and it invites the public to come in and see the farm. We do behind the scenes tours and lots of programs and camps. So it's great for young people to get excited about agriculture, innovation, and understanding how it can be used to help mitigate climate change. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Bill. Now we'll hear from our second speaker, Dr. Eric Gerbrand. Eric is a research director for the BC Blueberry Council, Raspberry Industry Development Council, and BC Strawberry Growers Association. Eric directs research and innovation for the three berry groups, as well as through his research farm in Chilliwack, with collaborating scientists from academia and government. Eric will speak to the BC berry producers' recent experience with climate emergency. Over to you, Eric. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, David, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and speak a little bit about the impacts of extreme weather events on berry crops in BC, with a special focus on the events in 2021. First, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on the three berry organizations that represent commercial growers in BC. The BC Blueberry Council represents BC blueberry growers. There's more than 600 of them, and there's approximately 30,000 acres in production, making it one of the most important horticultural commodities in Canada. It's also an important driver of export value for the Canadian economy. BC blueberries are sold as fresh product or frozen product, and they're marketed around the world. The Raspberry Industry Development Council represents growers who farm on approximately 2,000 acres, most of which is in a 10-kilometer radius around the Abbotsford Airport. The majority of raspberry product is harvested by machine and then frozen before it being marketed internationally. The BC Strawberry Growers Association represents a considerably smaller industry based on about 500 acres, with most product being sold fresh right here in BC. Since many growers of berries produce more than one of these commodities, maybe even three, the industry organizations have been working together for several years to invest in research and development. And this is really just to address common issues such as climate change. For instance, we manage a joint breeding program to develop new cultivars, as well as evaluate new cultivars being produced by other breeding programs around the world. And we share many of the same common pests and diseases across berry crops. And so we invest in research that will address problems that face all different crops. Our vision is a competitive, profitable, and environmentally sustainable BC berry sector, and our mission is to innovate superior practices and berry genetics to increase revenue, decrease cost of production, and improve the environmental sustainability of BC berry production. To accomplish this mission, we have four main strategies. We improve management of key weeds, pests, and pathogens. We enhance cultural practices to improve production efficiency and fruit quality. We adopt technologies and labor-saving solutions that improve efficiency and fruit quality, both pre-harvest and post-harvest. And then we develop and evaluate new varieties. We have an integrated approach here where, as we develop our program, we're taking a systematic and integrated mindset that acknowledges the centrality of making genetic improvement in berry cultivars through the long-term process of berry breeding. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. We also work in areas of pathology, entomology and pests, pollination and fruit quality, and horticultural management and climate change mitigation strategies. Following that background, I'll shift gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about the interesting year that we just went through. First of all, just as the berry season started to get going last year, we went through a period of sustained extreme heat. As anyone who's ever baked a pie with berries before can attest, berries don't do so well when you get them super hot. And so a lot of the fruit just baked on the bush. We had substantial losses of fruit across all three commodities, but the degree to which we saw these damages were dependent on the variety, and it also was moderated by some of the field-based conditions, such as the microclimate in that field and production practices that influence the relative humidity in the crop. Second, just as the season was wrapping up and plants were entering dormancy, extreme flooding occurred in a few thousand acres across several regions of the Fraser Valley, with the worst and most sustained period of inundation occurring in the Sumas Flats. A small amount of raspberries and strawberries were flooded, but approximately 1,000 acres of blueberries were underwater for what I've been calling an extreme severe flooding condition, and that was up to 2 weeks and in up to 10 feet of water. Just like animals, plants need oxygen to support cellular activity, and even near dormancy, plant tissues can be killed during sustained periods of flooding. We are starting to enter the new season now, and the full effects of the flooding have yet to be tallied, though growers are working hard to either replant or rejuvenate their plantings. Going back to that extreme weather heat event, here's some pictures of the effects of high heat and UV on berries, where the berries turn color and literally baked while still on the plant. Some images of flooding show the type of necrosis caused by extreme flooding, affecting above ground plant tissues, roots, and even organisms such as earthworms in the soil. As I mentioned, we're coming out of this event, but we spent time in the winter evaluating the extent of the damage in different fields and to different tissues. Some tissues, as you can see on the left, were totally dead as a result of the flooding, but other older wood at the base of a blueberry plant can survive flooding for a certain amount of time. And so we've gone through several fields and stumped them, basically cut them down to about knee height, and then we're hoping that they will regrow again in the new season, though we're really not sure how well these plants are going to recover. Finally, I'd like to highlight some of the work that we're doing in berries to combat climate change challenges. As mentioned before, our long-term strategy is to develop cultivars that are more resilient to extreme weather events, such as having traits that make it possible for us to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions of our production system. For example, in raspberry, we prioritize development of root rot resistance, meaning that we can find ways to get around applying chemical controls and in anticipation of rainy weather that will make root rot more severe. Also, we're looking for ways to adapt to events such as the heat dome last summer through studying biochemical and molecular basis for fruit quality, and that's so that we can develop varieties, for example, that have a greater waxy cuticle that would protect them from heat and UV. As temperatures during the late summer and fall are expected to increase, we are working to develop varieties that set fruit buds better under these conditions, and that should improve profitability and productivity in the climate of the future. And in several ways, we're working to develop traits so that we can reduce the number of times farmers need to enter fields with tractors. Every time a grower has to go into the field to spray an agricultural chemical, they're burning diesel and they're using product, and that results in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the flip side of it is that if our varieties can resist diseases, then they'll become more productive, and we'll be able to produce more food per unit of agricultural activity, reducing the carbon footprint of each pound of food. Another strategy that we're working toward, and this is part of some work that's currently funded by Genome BC, is to address a complex issue of blueberry viruses. And this is taking a multi-pronged approach, which you can see in the graph on the right-hand side here. And then we're developing a project to mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering carbon. And then finally, we're working on dealing with emerging pests and diseases and reducing nitrogen inputs for our crops.
Thank you, Eric. Now we'll hear from our last speaker, Dr. Jennifer Grenz. Jennifer is an assistant professor jointly appointed in the faculties of forestry and land and food systems. She is an Indigenous ecologist who is using food systems lens to bridge agrarian and traditional food systems through the reclamation of traditional land stewardship practices. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, David. Good to be with you all today. I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you this morning from the lands of the Pentlich speaking people, which is known as beautiful Parksville, British Columbia, from our little farm surrounded by forest. So hello, everyone. I am a proud Inkapamuk woman of mixed ancestry, and my family comes from both the Lytton First Nation and Bonaparte First Nations. And I'm going to speak to you this morning about some of the devastating impacts that have happened that many of us have watched on the news, but I've experienced at the familial level. Issues that aren't captured necessarily on the news. So just let me finish introducing myself. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Agroecology and a PhD in Integrated Studies in Land and Food Systems. My slides don't seem to be advancing here. Can someone go? Yeah, sorry, it's not working. Okay. I've been an invasive species specialist and ecologist in the province for close to 20 years. And over that time, came to see some of the continual failings of, based on, I think, a colonial understanding of nature. That doesn't necessarily include humans in it, and a conservation lens that is not necessarily acknowledging how Indigenous people see their role in the ecosystem. And so my scholarship is focusing on applying an Indigenous worldview to ecological restoration as well as invasive species management. And so instead of calling it ecological restoration, I call it land healing, because, this is much more multidimensional than we often think, when we're restoring lands. We're very much talking about food systems. Can the slide be advanced, please? And so in my personal life, I'm a plant knowledge holder. I collect plants for foods and ceremonies and medicines for friends and family. And, through that work, came to recognize even within my own Western scientific education that, we were sort of misunderstanding, these systems that are right next to many of our farms. In terms of their productivity, in terms of their potential, and so this has led me to begin work on doing what I call bridging food systems, where, our focus is end up so much in terms of food systems on agriculture, not necessarily acknowledging the importance of, what we sometimes call traditional food systems, which are important not just to Indigenous communities, but also, many people living in rural communities as well. Next slide, please. And so for me, when we're looking at land, especially in the context of a rapidly changing climate, we have to go beyond these colonial notions that are sort of aesthetic in terms of naturalness, that things will just sort of take care of themselves, and don't need us, in terms of interventions, or that, human interaction has largely brought harm. Whereas our Indigenous ecology teaches us that we actually have a very active role to play, in stewarding these systems continually. And in fact, some of their issues probably go back to the fact that we don't have the same degree of relationship with land that we had in the past. An example of that would be Garry Oak ecosystems, like the picture on the left there, that are essentially starch production, bulb production farms, in this case of the Cowichan people, that require human intervention. Otherwise, we have canopy closure, we have, bulbs that are not as large that are produced. So, we need to start seeing ourselves as part of shaping these systems. Next slide, please. And so the work that I'm touching on today, so I was brought in to work on the recovery from the McKay Creek wildfire, which is approximately 11 kilometers north of Lillooet, British Columbia, and covered an area of over 25,000 hectares. and covered 4 different biogeoclimatic zones. And had significant impacts, not just in terms of quote unquote naturalized areas, but also to agriculture as well. And I was brought in originally to look at vegetation trajectories, in the wildfire recovery process across those biogeoclimatic zones. Next slide, please. And I know that, we all saw on the news, the devastation that happened, across a number of these fires, over this past year. But, what we don't see on the news is the recovery phase, and what a monumental task that is, and the continued harm, that's brought to any of these communities. And I'm not just talking about, the 2-legged communities, but also the 4-legged communities as well. Next slide, please. And so in some of these areas where we have moderate level burns, we start to see some level of recovery, on its own. Next slide, please. And next slide again, please. But then we get into more severe burns, where it becomes even more difficult to figure out, what we actually do. And I'm just showing you some, just some of these pictures. This is the stuff that you don't get to see necessarily, right? But then we have situations like this. This is what climate change brings in fire regimes. Tell me what we do with something like this, right? And this is where we have to have, really serious discussions about how we move forward. And now we're more susceptible to issues around flooding, which we also experienced. And so what became evident when I started to begin work on, looking at vegetation trajectories is that we're still working even in a multi-stakeholder way in individualized silos. And we need to recognize that, what we're talking about here is actually recovery of food systems for people, food systems for wildlife, and in taking that lens, that can allow us to enter into the conversations that we do need to have, about changes in speciation, how we actually replant again or, revive these systems again under a changing climate, right? So trying to establish plants when we have continued high temperatures in these regions every summer. Sorry, I'm out of time. But, I'll get to some of the solutions that we've come up with later in the discussion. But I think that, this has forced us into a situation where we can have these meaningful discussions moving forward about how we consider these systems as we heal them.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just want to remind everyone that following the panel session, there will be an interactive Q&A session with you, the audience. You can ask your question anytime to the talk using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. You can also upvote questions as they appear, and we'll draw upon those most popular questions during the Q&A session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the rest of our panel. Dr. Anik Rozik is a Chief Scientific Officer at Terramera, where she leads the discovery and R&D development of their Actigate targeted performance technology. And Dr. Michelle de Souza is a molecular ecologist and researcher at the University of Guelph Center for Biodiversity Genomics. She has a broad interest in biodiversity conservation and is the lead for the McCain Foods Farms of the Future. Thank you both for joining us today. So we'll start with, so as we've heard, our climate reality has changed. We are no longer observers of climate chaos as something that happens elsewhere. What is clear going forward, our agriculture and food sectors will require innovative climate-focused solutions to increase resiliency and ensure food sustainability on the one hand, while providing real-world climate solutions to address the global problem of greenhouse gases. Government, NGOs, and companies around the world are adopting climate-positive agriculture agenda. In Canada, 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from crop and livestock production separate from fossil fuel. One of the approaches pledged to combat climate change during the net zero emissions transition are regenerative practices. So my first question is to Anna Rosick. Terramera is focusing on regenerative agriculture as one of the solutions to address climate change. Annette, can you explain the concept of regenerative agriculture and Terramera's plan in this space?
Yeah, thanks, David. Regenerative agriculture is built on 6 principles and 4 ecosystem processes. And the 6 principles are the minimal disturbance on the ground, no-till, known as no-till. Armor on the ground is the second one, which is leaving dead plant material after harvest on the ground to avoid wind erosion, water erosion, and the like. Planting cover crops is the third principle. Diversity, bringing in perhaps more than one crop to avoid monoculture, and encouraging diverse growth around the fields that are being farmed by machines to create as much biodiversity between fields that will then benefit the crop as well. Living root systems, so a focus on the rhizosphere and a healthy soil around the root system of plants, and the integration of livestock. The 4 ecosystem processes are focused on energy, so sunlight, water, nutrients, and biodiversity. And you might ask, what is the difference between regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture? And I would say sustainable agriculture is more like about maintaining things, maintaining the soil and the health of our fields to the extent that we can maintain the profit. Regenerative agriculture goes further than that. It is focused on building. When we take a field, when we take a piece of nature, a piece of forest, or a piece of swamp, and we drain it, we make it ready for agriculture, we change the natural state of the soil, and then we build, sow plants, usually just one crop. We have, soil erosion happen. When we harvest plants, we take nutrients away, like there's a net removal of nutrients from the field by harvesting the plant. And so over time, the soil starts depleting. That's a natural thing to happen when we start using nature to grow food. So maintaining it to the extent that we can keep producing food, that's sustainability. But to build back the soil to its natural state, that is what regenerative agriculture is about. And it is doing more than just the minimum that's necessary to sustain profits. So what is Terramera's role in this? So we have taken a focus on one of the 4 ecosystem processes, which is nutrients. And nutrients is nitrogen, is phosphate, is potassium, is all our micronutrients like manganese and magnesium. But it is also, to a large extent, soil organic carbon. And so we are building technology that measures these nutrients in a real-time fashion and makes that knowledge available to the farmer so that they can actively participate in maintaining and building back the best possible nutrient and carbon qualities in the soil. And this is a very complex undertaking, but measuring an accurate quantification and making that information available to the farmer in an easy, convenient, and fast way, that is our priority right now, and we hope to have products available here very soon.
Thank you, Annette. I think we'll come back to this build back question a little bit later, as Jennifer and you have alluded to in different systems, but I think build back is one of those points that we should probably touch on a little bit later in the discussion. So I wanted to bring Michelle D'Souza into the conversation. Michelle, you're from the Diversity of Biodiversity and Genomics. You're working on a project called Farms of the Future. Can you give me a better sense of what the genomics role is in regenerative agriculture, and how it plays a role in scaling agri-technology and innovation in the systems that you're working in?
Yes, of course. Thanks, David, and thanks, panel, for the lovely insights today. I'm not in BC currently. I'm in New Brunswick, and that's kind of where McCain's biggest production plant is based, here in Florenceville, Bristol. And McCain Foods, as a global leader in food production, has made some pretty strong commitments to reassess how they are producing their products, potatoes primarily, and moving towards more sustainable strategies. And that's kind of where they've invested also in this idea of regenerative agriculture, which Annette so wonderfully explained just now. And so one of the key targets that they are working towards developing is the farms of the future. So these are 3 McCain-owned commercially operating farms across 3 different growing regions. There's one currently online here in Florenceville, Bristol. It began in 2021, last year. And the goal of these farms of the future is basically to test and experiment these regenerative practices, with the goal basically of making sure that, when McCain asks its growers to implement regenerative practices, that these are feasible on their farms, and not just feasible, but also economically viable. And I think the impressive part about these farms of the future is they're not small research farms. They're actually commercial-sized, fully operational farms. So here we're getting to actually see the applicability of regenerative practices on a commercial scale, as well as invest in that infrastructure, in that experimentation, and all of the problems that arise as we try to scale a lot of these processes up. And my role on this project, in partnership with the Center for Biodiversity Genomics, is to bring in that biology component. So, we're very familiar with looking at various soil structure, soil chemistry. Biology often is a little harder to bring in because soil biology is incredibly complex. And this is kind of where the role of genomics really has the opportunity to highlight this really important piece to this bigger problem of how do we assess regenerative agriculture, what is healthy soil, how do we work towards healthy soil, and understand how what our role is, as Jennifer alluded. We are part of that system as well, and we do have a role to play. So genomics is really about understanding who are all the key players, and giving us a really fine-tuned resolution to better understand these processes. And in relationship with McCain, they have 370,000 acres of fields all around the world, working with 3,500 different farmers across 6 continents. They work at a large scale, and so they're really interested and have made a very strong commitment, actually, to implement regenerative agricultural practices across all of their potato acres by 2030. And so it's really nice to see them investing in this kind of multidisciplinary approach to ask how best do we get to that point, understanding that they play a really big part in this conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. So I want to just circle back to our speakers to explore further what Agri-Smart solutions they are researching, testing, or adopting to prepare for a changing climate. I'm going to bring Jennifer Grenz back into the discussion. Jennifer, can you describe a little bit further your collaboration with the Lillooet Tribal Council and how this research translates into your research approaches that you're undertaking together?
Well, I think that, the approach is is a much more relational one. So like I mentioned in what I was saying, we bring multi-stakeholder groups together, but we still sort of work in a siloed sort of way. But when we're talking about food systems, they are inherently relational. And I think Indigenous communities are, very good at, working in that relational way. And so in that collaboration, we're not saying like, how do we put things back? We're saying, let's take a pause and talk about what can actually be here now, what can thrive here, and how do we revitalize what are actually food systems, on these lands. Whereas there's sort of an automatic nature that can happen in terms of how we do wildfire recovery, right? Like we want to get in there and we want to seed and we want to plant trees and we want to bring these back. Whereas, I see so much wisdom, especially from plant knowledge holders and elders, and I feel like wisdom that I've gained from them in saying, wait, we have to have these very difficult discussions about who is on the land now. And I say who, I mean, tree species, berry species, all of that. And then are we looking for solutions to that on the lands? And so that's part of the collaboration as well. So, Indigenous people have been playing with plant genetics since time immemorial. So who is left on the land? How are they doing? And, we want to make sure also that when we're, working to revitalize and heal and build resilient systems, that perhaps we're going to those populations that have been, continuing to thrive and do well under climate change. So, the approach is really one that is like food systems oriented, with just this, let us not act in an automatic way in terms of how we do ecological restoration. And it is incredibly interesting, the resistant response that comes from that, because there's just this rush. We got to hurry. We got to, but there's wisdom in that pause. And there are very complex conversations that have to be had, and so I think, this, genomics is very much a part of that as well, right? So, so I think that's, how things are different in terms of how we're approaching recovery. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to have a follow-on question with that, Jennifer, from one of our questions that have been posted here. Perhaps just digging a little bit deeper into the differences between healing approaches and restoration approaches, ecological restoration approaches. You've talked about time and letting time to think about these things. Can you kind of describe a bit about the difference in approaches from your perspective?
Well, I think that, in my own work for 2 decades, ecological restoration sort of has a formula attached to it, right? So, we remove the species that quote unquote don't belong, and we bring in the ones that we've decided do belong. And it can become very automatic. And when I'm talking about land healing, it's much more multidimensional. We're going down at the community level and saying, what does the community need to thrive? What does the community need to be resilient? And that can be things, beyond even food systems. This can be, how do we bring, mental well-being? How are we tending to recreational values? How are we tending to agrarian values? How are we, how are we increasing relationship with land if we're not so directly reliant upon it, say, for food? Is it through land-based learning, all of that, so that then as we, write the story going forward for these lands, it can look totally different than if we had just done sort of a conventional ecological restoration approach. So instead, we're writing into the story how we deepen that connection through land-based learning opportunities, or even introducing, like, I have projects we're working on where we're introducing, agrarian crops, into these, systems that, are considered like Indigenous food systems, to blow the minds of, people of government working with us. No, you're native. You want native plants here, right? But that's wrong. Like, that's not who we are, and we're trying to meet other goals. So for me, it's so much different because it includes all parts of our lives, in determining, what things look like going forward.
Thank you. I want to now come back to perhaps a comment that I'm trying to remember if it was Michelle or Annette, or perhaps it was both, sort of building back, we're in managed agrarian systems, building back and building back soil, building back perhaps the local ecology. How does that approach, how do you think about that in terms of, what steps need to be taken to support that? Perhaps Michelle?
Yeah, steps taking, so sorry if I understand your question. What are the steps we need to take to begin to regenerate some of the soil that we've lost?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that question kind of begins with our understanding of soil health. And I think really that's very much in its infancy. I think we have a long history of, understanding what land use practices, for example, can lead to better yields. But I mean, better yields isn't the end game when we're thinking about soil health. Some of the things that we've been doing so far are depleting that soil health. One of the soil microbial ecologists here kind of referred to the soil as the infrastructure on your farm, and I kind of really liked that analogy. Just because the practices we put in place should be playing a role in helping and building that soil to better armor us against various sorts of problems that are to come. I see the role here, at least that genomics has to play in just getting us a better understanding, not just of what this means in terms of productivity, but also just what this means in terms of the connection of the systems that exist, the biology of these very complex ecosystems basically within the soil. And I think that's really where it needs to start. I think there's a lot of tools at our disposal now and a lot of practices that we've had been put in place, and we really need to kind of bring those two worlds together and better understand that system.
Thank you. I just want to touch on perhaps coming back to Bill, just kind of switch gears a little bit. Looking at a producer level, when you're looking at implementing innovations for people and planet, as you've mentioned in your presentation, how do you evaluate a technology or an innovation from your business perspective, and how do you look at it from a climate change perspective? How do these two come together so that you're helping both your business and climate? What kind of thinking do you have around that when you're thinking about new innovations and technologies and adopting those types of things?
I would say it's a very integrative approach, and also one that still requires a lot of due diligence and trial and error, to be honest. I'll just take like our beef production as an example. We kind of got into this 3 or 4 years ago, kind of have some experience in dairy, and really looked at it as an opportunity. And beef is certainly one of the more challenging livestock sectors that are kind of have a bit of a target in terms of methane production. So I think there's an opportunity to do the research and explore that. I think the market also is interested in finding products that are more sustainable and climate friendly. So I think you're kind of taking a lot of different perspectives, whether it's from our producer perspective all the way to the consumer. So like in our case, we're using everything from genomic testing of the cattle that we're raising, and also using IVF, in vitro fertilization technology, to kind of enhance the genetics of those generations, to ensure that we can get more efficient production of growth, and just looking at quality from an end product perspective. On the nutrition side as well, we've been working with different byproducts. So mentioned liquid whey feeding ad lib for the beef. There's a fibrous kind of oat byproduct that we use. So again, finding local opportunities to kind of upcycle what would be considered byproduct or waste products and putting them to better use. And then ultimately being able to measure those. And so we've been fortunate to kind of set up our facilities as a research facility. So we have sensors, we have it's a grow safe, Vital grow safe system. So we can measure feed intakes, daily gains on individual cattle. So it really just allows us to start to measure the impacts, as well as more recently working with a collaboration with another company on feeding types of seaweed and looking at how that can affect enteric fermentation, reduce methane production, and having the equipment that we can actually measure, CO2 emissions from individual cattle and be able to quantitate that. So yeah, and then even from a manure and soil management, like we're working on a grass finished product and brand, and that's sort of the business development opportunity. So we're producing more forage as grass, which is again meets a lot of those sustainability criteria, as well as taking the manure and composting it. So it can be, we can add carbon to the soil, or we can actually market it, sell it, redistribute it to areas in our region or elsewhere that could to benefit from nutrients and carbon kind of in a combination in a very stable product like compost. So yeah, I guess I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but it's really this iterative, integrative approach of like looking at what is the market looking for, what does it need, what are the important issues, and then are there innovations and approaches that we can use to help solve some of those problems.
Thank you, Bill. So Eric, I want to come back to you with a question. The berry industry in your presentation identified a number of climate challenges. How can research investment be tailored to address these problems related to climate impacts while providing solutions that will drive adoption by your growers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think Michelle kind of answered similarly to how I would answer that question, in that if we're going to invest in research and develop research that's meaningful to the production system in the context of berries here, if we're going to address climate change impacts and deliver solutions that growers can use, then it needs to be also beneficial to their profitability, because growers won't be able to adopt something that isn't commercially viable for them. So if we're developing a new production practice or a new variety, it has to provide economic value to the grower, otherwise they're not going to adopt it. What we need to do here is look for the win-win situations where we're doing something good for the environment, but then we're also doing something that's good for business. And that's the way that we'll be able to drive adoption of those practices. So just an example, I brought up root rot in raspberry earlier, and that's caused by a pathogen called Phytophthora rubi, and actually another similarity there to potatoes. Phytophthora infestans is what infects potatoes, but this is a raspberry version of the same genus of pathogen. We're hopeful to be able to develop molecular markers to screen for root rot resistance to the Phytophthora pathogen, but progress is slow. There's currently a breeding program in Scotland at the James Hutton Institute, and they've got a marker for Phytophthora resistance that's derived from an old raspberry variety called Latham. But that marker only really predicts one of the two loci that confer resistance to root rot. And so it's not really a good indicator of whether or not a potential new variety that's being developed through plant breeding, whether or not it's going to be actually resistant. It's basically a 50-50 chance, and only for things that are derived from that old raspberry variety called Latham. And this kind of underpins the challenges that we face in terms of using genomics to improve plant genetics so that they're better for growers, but then also will be things that we can grow with fewer chemical inputs and fewer tractor operations, and therefore have a benefit to the environment, is that genomic resource development in small fruit crops like raspberry have been slow in their development. It's because the industries that are investing in them are relatively small compared with, let's go back to potato again, the amount of acreage worldwide of raspberry production is so much smaller than potato. And so there hasn't been as much investment in the development of genomic resources for our crops. And in the context of blueberry, while it's a burgeoning crop that's really growing globally at a very rapid pace, we've also got issues with the autotetraploid nature of the crop that make it more computationally challenging to develop molecular tools. As we're starting to get over these barriers, but the next biggest barrier is going to be the availability and the costs of the methods for genotyping seedling populations within a breeding program in order to facilitate marker discovery. So the research community is trying to pool their resources now to address some of these challenges. And as we look to coordinate the development and utilization of genotyping platforms, this will allow us to get bulk discounts for third-party service providers for doing screening work. And finally, we've got the challenge of the perennial nature of our crops and the relatively long juvenility period, where it takes a few years before the crop gets to a point where you can evaluate the fruit or evaluate its root rot resistance or whatever the trait may be. And so funding this work is challenging because most funding programs, with the exception of a few programs, they've got 18 to 24 month timelines. And so it's difficult to develop tools for a long-lived perennial crop if based on that limitation of programs. And so what we're hoping in the future is that we'll be able to pursue some more long-term funding schemes so that we can get the proverbial low-hanging fruit in terms of molecular markers through genomic research. And then just to bring back to where I started on this question, if we could develop genomic tools for crops that could improve traits like root rot resistance, then we'll not only be making it a more productive system for the agriculture industry, but we'll also be providing ways to reduce climate change impacts of our production system.
Thank you, Eric. I just want to have one follow-up question to that. You've mentioned the long time frames for breeding. What do you see the opportunities or barriers to using gene editing tools like CRISPR in this research? Is the timing right now to shorten some of those breeding timelines, or what? How is your industry thinking about that?
I think the time is right for sure. The technologies, CRISPR in particular, has come a long way in the last 5 years. I think the barrier there is whether or not gene-edited varieties of horticultural crops will be acceptable in the marketplace. And that's not something that I think has been determined yet. So, GMO berries is likely not something that the market is going to accept, but gene editing is a different technology. So I think that main barrier is whether or not people are going to be willing to purchase crops that have been gene edited.
Perhaps, Michelle, from your perspective, in your work, and you're doing a lot of, analyzing a lot of data, what is the sense of perhaps saying, we've got some interesting microorganisms, we perhaps could make a cocktail, we could perhaps, change them in a way that we can get the right metabolic pathways enhanced so we can capture more carbon, we can store more carbon and sequester that. What's your feeling around that, and especially with working with a large national company like McCain?
Yeah, that I was really afraid we didn't have to go into this because personally, I kind of I'm aligning with Jen here. I have this sense that we're just diving into this world, and when you look at I mean, just understanding soil microbes, for example, right? Like you go into the soil, you take out the DNA, and then you know, ask the question, okay, who's left on this land, as Jen kind of like, who's in the soil? And then how you get that answer is by, you know, looking at these curated reference libraries and finding a match. The problem is there's no standard reference library when we're looking across these systems. There's so much variation when we look at even the different, you know, instruments that are generating this data. And so there's challenges still that we need to face. And so, you know, me personally, I think we're still at that stage of understanding, and it is a complex system, and there's a lot to understand. Not to say that, you know, modifying beneficial microorganisms, troubleshooting bad soil, there's insights gained along this way that we can start to harness. I mean, just look at the agri-tech industry growing. Terramera is a perfect example of how, you know, you can start looking at microorganisms that are beneficial to absorb nutrients and promote plant growth. There's tools to be had. Whether this is like, you know, a silver bullet approach, I really don't think so. And I think we're a little bit a ways from being able to really manipulate these systems yet, because we don't truly understand what's going on. But I hope with the, you know, with the computational tools we have at our disposal now, with all of the research going on in private and public sectors, that we start to get advances in this field. At least that's my hope. But I still think we need to be patient.
Thank you. Appreciate your answer on that. I just want to touch on, you know, we've touched on gene editing and some of the regulations around that. We've touched on, Jennifer, you know, you're working within a full ecosystems and looking at food security and sustainability. In your view, what is the role of government and policies in incentivizing and helping to pivot towards more sustainable agricultural practices from your perspective? Maybe we'll start with you, Jennifer.
Well, that's a big question. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, maybe kind of pivoting a little bit back to what Michelle was just talking about, is that there are a lot of lessons left to be learned from our lands that we, you know, a singular worldview perhaps has inhibited us from being able to take in those lessons. And so when we're talking about, you know, building resiliency and sustainability into food systems, you know, perhaps the answer is in spending more time on lands and understanding, you know, how, when you look upon the landscape, instead of, you know, just saying, oh, look at nature, instead, if you saw it as, you know, the sophisticated technological, you know, systems and food systems that they were and they still can be, you know, perhaps we would gain some more answers in terms of, you know, what direction that we you know, go in the future, right? So, you know, for me, I'm talking to, you know, people at different levels of government about learning about, you know, traditional stewardship practices on the lands, and not that Indigenous knowledge is held to the past, but that there are lessons there that we can learn and then, you know, bring into the future, because we're modern people, right? And so some of these stewardship techniques need to be changed to adapt to the modern context. But I really see this sort of, you know, need to integrate Indigenous knowledge right now and interest in that, which is wonderful. But I think that, you know, we need to look at it in a sort of a bigger way in terms of informing how we move forward, not from a historic sense, but in terms of, you know, what are the lessons there that we can learn from the plants, the soils, and take and you know, and use technology even necessarily maybe to bring that forward into the future. So, you know, any help with reclaiming those practices and modernizing them, I think, you know, has a lot of potential. And that's certainly what I'm encouraging, you know, different government agencies to be looking to.
Thank you. That's great. No, that's important points. So this kind of brings me to another point, and all of you represent different perspectives on this. Genome Canada announced today that they have a large competition coming forward in the climate action space. Within Genome Canada projects, these are large-scale, multi-year, multi-million-dollar projects typically. And so I come back to one of your points in this slide, Jennifer, but this applies to probably everybody here. How can we ensure that, when we're looking and we're building these teams going forward over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months, how do we ensure that the multi-stakeholder approaches are integrated and interdisciplinary in these research partnerships? What do we need to think about to bring in all the necessary voices, whether it's at a farm level, whether it's at First Nations level, corporate level? How do we bring all these players together in a cohesive way that all perspectives are included and the research is built around that, including, I would say, social scientists and humanists as well within those groups. Perhaps Eric, do you want to start with that question?
Sure. I don't know if I could address it from a general standpoint, but maybe I could go back to something I brought up during my presentation about blueberry viruses and the way that we're going about taking an integrated, interdisciplinary, regional approach to confronting a very complex problem. So I was running a little low on time there during my presentation, so I didn't go into depth on this, but I'll talk a little bit more about something called blueberry scorch virus, which is a lethal plant virus that causes plants to die within 1 or 2 years, and it's spread by aphids. So we've been working over the last approximately 8 months to develop a team's approach to breaking down this complex problem into its component parts, and then tackle that in little subgroups, and then coordinate together in order to integrate the work that's being done in each area. So specifically, we've got work looking at epidemiology and diagnostic tools for this virus and other viruses that are very similar but have different prognoses for the plant. And I'd mentioned that's a project that's currently being funded by Genome BC with an excellent research team at Simon Fraser University and Phytodiagnostics. So we're looking to try and sort out the epidemiology and the diagnostics of the viruses with that group. We've got some excellent researchers at Agriculture Canada in Ottawa and in Agassiz that are looking at the taxonomy of the aphid that transmits this virus, so that we can understand how that may be changing based on potentially on climate change, the aphid species complex that we're dealing with. We're working with another researcher at Simon Fraser University and also with Terra Mera and iTech Open to develop a way of monitoring the spread of these viruses throughout the Fraser Valley using satellite imagery and drones. And then we're also working with our breeding programs to look at ways to, and you brought this up just a moment ago, David, using gene editing potentially to go back in time and try and fix these problems out in the field. Because if there's techniques like spray-induced genomic silencing, host-induced genomic silencing, RNA interference technologies that could be used to combat these viruses in ways that were not possible even a few years ago. So those are basically 4 different areas of research that we are tackling in small groups, but then we're also coordinating with people in Arkansas, Washington, Oregon, in Ontario, to work as a group across a whole pile of different disciplines, bring some real smart people to the table and try and unravel this complex problem.
Thank you, Eric. Annette, from your perspective, from a company developing technologies, what's an ideal or what's an integrated project look like for you as a agri-tech company?
Yeah, for us, it is really important to understand what the farmer needs and how they're using technology so that we can create it in the right way and, at the right price that the farmer actually will use it. So having boots on the ground to actually be in the field, be with the farmer, and understand their day-to-day and the problems that they're having is really important to, even before you create new technology. Creating technology in the isolation of a lab or workshop is not going to work all the way through, right? Having an idea is great, but if you can't shape it, apply it, develop it to be used by people, it's not going to go anywhere.
Thank you. Michelle, how did your, I'm going to sort of do the poor panel management thing and perhaps ask this question to all of you, because I think it's really important when we're thinking about, Genome BC's working with teams and developing out projects over the next few months. So I'm going to do the panel, the wrong thing to do with panels and ask them all the kind of the similar questions, or at least most of you. So Michelle, how did your partnership come together with McCain and your biodiversity center at Guelph?
Right. I think McCain is used to doing this. Like from its very start, it partnered with growers in the region all around the world to produce product, right? So they've always kind of had this idea that we need to bring in experts. We don't all need to learn how to farm. We already have people who know how to do this. And so, when they thought of this idea of, investing in regenerative agriculture, they developed the farms of the future really as a playground, and they're inviting people into it. We have tech experts, we have researchers, we have farmers. They come in, they tackle these problems together. We're building new machinery. We're bringing in different types of soil testing. And I think the quite remarkable part about this too is, all of this data is going to be available. Like McCain's not holding on to any of this. This is a project, an investment that they want to see used across the agricultural sector, not just in Canada, but around the world. And I think that that's kind of a really interesting approach. It's purchase the land, take all the risk away from people who actually need the land for sustenance, and have everybody come and do the innovative work, do the research. And that's kind of the framework I think that they've gone with. And I'm seeing it be really, really effective here in Florenceville. I'm really, really looking forward to seeing what this is going to look like in their other farms around the world.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Jennifer, I just want to finish off that question with you. And how do we bring these other rural voices, rural communities, First Nations perspectives into our research, that they're really, truly meaningful and working together on which sometimes is short-term projects and some levels 3 or 4 year projects. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we have those voices within the mix of partners in a project?
I think that, so often this sort of multi-stakeholder or multi-expertise approach of putting teams together is where you actually lose the real benefit, especially of Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous worldview, but also we lose out the benefit of bringing together people with different areas of expertise, because we're still there ultimately representing a stake or, some piece of knowledge, but there's so much value in sort of always, when you bring people together, backing up several steps. And this is part of some of the policy work that I've been doing, where we talk first about our values and unite around common values, and then make it clear what is the story that we're trying to tell together before we get into who's doing what and taking on the thing, because we can end up sort of losing the very purpose of why we've brought people together. And I think that, so often, in my experience, and I've been on both sides of it, representing Indigenous communities as well as, representing government agencies to Indigenous communities, is that when we have that multi-stakeholder approach, we sort of lose out on really guiding the process from the beginning, because we're not going to represent our connection to land as some sort of stake, because we are the land, right? But in using a relational approach where we can say, we are all coming together around this value. We all care about providing food for our families, whether that comes from agrarian systems or traditional systems. How can we go forward together in doing that? And there's so much value in even the beginner's mind, right? Of people outside of your areas of expertise. Like I might be able to plant a seed with someone who's like way outside of my wheelhouse, right? And I think we lose that sometimes when we bring people together under their umbrella, and so I think, when we build teams and bring them together, we need to not be afraid to plant seeds elsewhere and have the kinds of exchanges and conversations that can, bring us those out of the box solutions that we so clearly need.
Excellent, thank you. I wanted to touch on another point as this build back and in healing from the group here. What are the similarities we're looking at, and what are the some of the differences you've seen between sort of traditional agrarian approaches and perhaps what you're doing, Jennifer? What should we be looking at from people's perspective when we're looking at healing the land and healing the soil? Maybe we'll start with Michelle. Do you want to perhaps answer that first?
Sure. Let me just make sure I understood your question. What are the approaches we need to take in healing
Yes,
the land?
exactly.
Sorry?
Yes, please.
What are the approaches we need to take? Well, I mean, I feel like I've kind of said this already. Take a pause and understand the system a little bit better, I think is where I sit with this. I mean, it's a very complex question, right? It's really about, I think, the way in which we've been doing farming for, at least in the commercial sense, has been one focused on productivity, and maybe that's not really what we should be focusing on. This idea of healing, I don't know how much it's been considered in the past, and how do we even know what healing is in these systems? What is good? What is healthy? Especially as things are changing. Like, I think we need to even just answer those very basic questions, and then use the tools that we have at our disposal to then move forward and kind of in a direction that we agree upon. How do we agree upon all of this too is a complex question, and I don't know if I'm the best person to really answer all of this. But yeah, it's a challenge for sure, and I'm very interested to hear what the other panelists think.
Thank you. Perhaps Bill, how do you kind of manage your land? You have some land and you grow crops. How are you looking at in terms of a balanced approach and working that land, but also making sure it's under certain practices? How do you approach that from a producer perspective?
I feel like I'm kind of speaking from a different perspective because we're running this as a business and trying to sustain that business year after year. So, and I love what I'm hearing, and I appreciate all the approaches and the insights and how we can improve our practices. So I'm kind of just speaking as a farmer. So the practices that we use are things like cover cropping. They're just more practical examples. We've installed irrigation a few years ago, which would happen to be timely. We do have the composting and just making sure, we do soil testing every year and evaluating, what the soil needs based on the crop. We've transitioned from kind of a 50-50 corn silage, grass silage mix to more of a grassland. So more established, root healthy soil biome, I would say. And we have an integration of cattle and land, so we're able to use the manure as a way to fertilize. So we don't really buy much of any commercial fertilizers. And with the grass crops too, there's no pesticides, herbicides being used there as well. So I think there's a couple of people. There's so much to learn, and I think farmers generally very open. But we have to, I think, and other people have said it make sure that there's a return on investment and that it makes sense from a farmer's perspective, that they can spend the money and see a benefit, maybe not immediate, but be convinced either through demonstrations like McCain is doing. But yeah, I feel it's reassuring kind of hearing the different approaches that we're able to share today. As a farmer, that we're going to continue to get more information, more education, and improve our approaches to taking care of the land, building it back up, and yeah, just being smart for the next generation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I just take perhaps a question from one of the Q&As here. I kind of like it. What can we do on an individual level as a regular non-scientist person, and also on a community level in our daily lives, to help build a more sustainable food and agriculture system? Anna, would you like to give a try on that?
Yeah, sure. We are all consumers, right? So our buying behavior has a huge influence on how things are produced. I actually got called a few years ago when a marketing consultant we had was asking me, do you buy organic? And I was like, yeah, but not always, because the organic produce in the store actually doesn't look that good. And it's much more expensive. But following that conversation, I thought, wow, I'm working on reducing chemical pesticides, and I'm working on promoting the use of biopesticides to grow food organically, and I'm not buying organic. It's something that doesn't make sense in my life, right? So and I started to buy organic very consciously, right? I went to stores where the organic aisle looked great. And I see more and more how the prices of organic food start approaching our conventional foods. And that's a great development to observe. So observing yourself, your behaviors, what you do, and bring yourself in line with what you think is right and what is natural. Like, I really resonate with what Jennifer said, that we think about our values first, and we think about our place in nature, and don't see nature as something that is separated from us, because we have to come we have come to use nature, right? Nature is there for us, and in many cases, nature is actually our enemy, right? There is the wind and rain that destroys our crops. There's the wildlife that eats it up, and so looking at the kind of our ways, our beliefs, of how we think about our place in nature and in the world, that is a really important first step. And then align your behavior, and as a consumer, you're very powerful. Align your consuming behavior and bring yourselves in harmony with your values. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Excellent, thank you. I just want to touch on another question here on from the Q&A. How can the research community find win-win situations that are both good for the environment and support economic viability of Canadian growers in a complex and competitive global economy? Perhaps, Eric, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. That actually kind of touched on the answer I gave to the first question that was asked earlier. So here's a couple of examples. Maybe I'll try to come up with on the spot here. So some work of my own that I've done over the last 5 years, funding through the Ministry of Agriculture, is to do on-farm demonstration trials to show reduced nitrogen rate applications in an unreplicated observational approach, working directly with collaborating growers to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's being applied to blueberries and raspberries. We had 17 blueberry fields, 5 raspberry fields, and for a total of 4 years, we went with lower rates of nitrogen, and then we looked at post-harvest nitrate, leaf tissue nitrogen, and then all sorts of parameters of fruit yield and productivity. So at the end of that, and we just presented these results recently at the Pacific Agriculture Show, we found that we could reduce nitrogen significantly in both cropping systems without any real negative impact on the production system. So while we can reduce the amount of nitrogen that ends up in the soil at the end of the season, which a lot of that will become a nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, we can have a win for the environment, but then also we're reducing input costs for the growers. And so they can be more profitable because their margins are higher if they don't have to apply so much fertilizer. So there's one win-win situation. Another one is a grant that's in development right now, is to develop best management or demonstrate best management practices in berries that can improve the sequestration of carbon as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's through using cover crops and precision irrigation in blueberry and raspberry. We're also collaborating with the hazelnut industry, the tree fruit industry, the wine grape industry, to try and drive the adoption of these best management practices that have a win for the environment, but then also have potential positive impacts on the productivity of the system. So it's a win for the grower as well. So yeah, those are two examples that come to mind right away.
Thank you. Just perhaps one last question from our audience here. Let me just, sorry, I'm just lost it. So what are just looking at genomics, where do you feel genomics can have the greatest impact on your work or on the work you're doing in your research, or that you feel could really answer some questions? And I want to come back to you, Jennifer. You mentioned genomics. You mentioned in one of your answers, but not much detail on it. Just wonder where you think genomics can have an impact on the type of work you're doing going forward.
Well, I think, paying attention to plants and soils that have otherwise maybe largely been ignored in this conversation. So, when we've invested so much in agrarian systems, we have to feed a lot of people, and that is where a lot of how we're feeding people is going to come from. However, we have traditional berry crops, out on our lands that are actually important to people, and then also to animals that people are also reliant upon, in rural communities and in Indigenous communities, that may have some answers to, some of these questions of resiliency, that we're looking for in terms of, cultivated berry crops. So, I see them as knowledge keepers on the land, that maybe are largely, not well understood enough yet. And so I think that's where we should be directing some of that attention. And I also see, in terms of culturally important plants, that we're, like, we were talking about earlier, we're a ways away from unleashing some of these tools, into the environment. However, they are an important part of the conversation about, species that can no longer or will no longer tolerate the climatic conditions that we have, but our values are such that we want to keep those, those plants or trees, into the future. So there may be solutions there as well.
Excellent, thank you. So I just perhaps one last question, perhaps for a couple of you on the panel. What is your prediction for the next 5 to 10 years for the agricultural food system in BC or in Canada? Annette, what's Terramera's vision for the agricultural food system?
I'd say, first of all, that we understand it a lot better, and kind of reiterating what the speakers here have said today. Understanding is where it all begins. And we live in an era where we have data collection, data capture technology that allows us to not just, look with our eyes and base our understanding on that kind of data, that the look and feel, taste data. no, we have a much more sophisticated tools available, and we have tools to make correlations with that data. We're in the era of machine learning, which, is actually not that new, but now we have data available to actually apply machine learning to that data. And so that will really revolutionize our understanding. And then, on the genomics level, we have data on the molecular level, which we definitely cannot see with our eyes. But this is the power of genomics, that we can analyze on down to the molecular level, and we can understand plant responses. We can understand microbiome responses to farmers' practices, to treatments, right, to pesticides, to plant biostimulants on a molecular level. And we can digest that data using machine learning. And that will just blow our minds. It will amazingly enhance our understanding of nature. And then, we sit back and we think about what we learned, and then we apply the right changes to our behavior. And the agriculture will look a lot different in 10 years. Yeah, it's a revolution happening right now.
Thank you. Is anybody else? Michelle, I saw you smiling. Do you want to tell us from your work, what you hope your work will be looking like 5 to 10 years from now, when McCain, plants, has their partners and farmers planting seeds in the ground? What do you hope will that look like?
Yeah. What I hope is we get to a place where we get more people coming on board and helping us measure, because the more we measure, the more we can monitor. And this kind of like circles back to that idea of healing, right? Like we don't know how to heal unless we know what's there. And so this idea of like bringing as many farms on board, having this collaborative network of even just understanding what's in the soil, because this technology, as Annette said, it's fast, it's cheaper than it ever was before. I think it was Eric who talked about this. The more samples we get, the cheaper it becomes, right? So just imagine, in 10 years, if we have all McCain farms, just as an example, come on board and give us even 5-10 samples from their farm every year. Think of the resolution we could have and what that could say in terms of climatic zones. We have tons of world data, right, in terms of that. Then we start adding this living layer onto all of these climatic models that we have. So I think the potential to use that data to inform changes in the future is actually quite remarkable. And I think that's probably where I'm the most excited.
And finally, I'm going to end with you, Jennifer, just because someone has a kind of a question. I just kind of want to end off with the 5 to 10 years picture and looking at the reflective, connective, respective approach that you're talking about. What do you see 5 to 10 years out for agri-food systems in BC?
Well, just in discussion with farmers, for example, in the Cowichan Valley and the Comox Valley, I see a future where there's a much less abrupt line or delineation, between agri-food systems and traditional food systems. That, if we were looking, at the drone level of farms, that instead of sort of fighting back, the forest or fighting back nature, that we start to see the landscape more integrated, and we're already seeing a desire to do that, even on our own farm, building vertical structure, allowing some of these native plants to come in that are providing shade, for our berry crops, for our herbs, for all of these things. So I think in 5 to 10 years, I would just love to have a bird's eye view and it be less obvious to me about where the quote unquote farms are, but instead that we just have a much more integrated looking food system, because I think, a number of those very simple, sort of what everyone's referring to now as nature-based solutions, can bring so much in terms of resiliency and sustainability to our farms.
Well, thank you. We're 10 minutes beyond 90 minutes, and I said I wouldn't go beyond 90 minutes, but I thank you again for taking all of your efforts and time to be on the panel and participating. Really appreciate it. So this concludes our time together. We hope you have enjoyed the conversation. Our next session, called The Blue Economy, Sustainable Aquatic Ecosystems for Food, starts at 11:05. You can access the session by returning to the event hub and clicking on the next session. Just a reminder that Genome Canada launched their Smart Agriculture and Food Systems competition with the aim to address many of the challenges discussed in this session today. We strongly encourage to check out our website or contact Genome BC directly if you have any questions. Thank you very much.